It's roughly 40,000 years ago. You're standing at the edge of a dry riverbed, and the sun is doing that thing it does in the late afternoon where everything turns a shade of gold that almost feels unfair. Your feet are cracked. Your shoulders are tight. You haven't eaten a full meal in 2 days, and the last thing you put in your mouth was a handful of bitter berries and a piece of dried meat that tasted mostly like dust and regret. You are lean. Not because you're disciplined, not because you have a meal plan or a morning routine or a subscription to some fitness app. You are lean because the world hasn't given you a choice. Now, flash forward. You're sitting in a chair. There's a screen in front of you, probably this one. There's food within arm's reach, possibly, and the biggest physical challenge your body will face today is carrying groceries from the car. And yet, somehow, your body still runs on the exact same software as that cracked foot human by the dry riverbed. That mismatch is what this video is about. Because here's the question, and I promise it's stranger than it sounds. Could ancient humans actually get fat? Like, biologically? Metabolically? Was obesity even possible for our prehistoric ancestors? And if it wasn't, which is what most people assume, then why does your body store fat the way it does? Why does it want to? Why does it fight so hard to keep every calorie you've ever eaten, as if something terrible is about to happen? The short answer is yes. Ancient humans could get fat, but the long answer, the real answer, is what this whole video is about. Let's go. Most people, when they picture a prehistoric human, picture something like a very tired, very thin person holding a spear. And that image isn't entirely wrong. Hunter-gatherer lifestyles involved enormous amounts of movement studies of modern foraging populations, like the Hadza in Tanzania, show adults averaging somewhere between 8,000 and 19,000 steps a day, depending on season, carrying loads, climbing, digging, walking distances that would make most modern people genuinely weep. Caloric expenditure was high. Caloric intake, on a good day, roughly matched it. But here's the thing. Not usually fat is not the same as biologically incapable of being fat. And this is where the assumption starts to crack. Your body doesn't care about your intentions. It doesn't know what year it is. It has one job, evolutionarily speaking, and that job is to keep you alive long enough to reproduce, and ideally, to do that in an environment where food might disappear at any moment. So it built a system, a very elegant, very stubborn, deeply ancient system for storing energy against future scarcity. That system is fat. Fat tissue, adipose tissue, technically is not a design flaw. It is not the body failing. It is the body doing exactly what it was built to do, and doing it extraordinarily well. Fat is stored energy. 1 gram of fat contains roughly 9 kilocalories. Compare that to 1 gram of carbohydrate, which gives you about 4. Fat is, calorie for calorie, the most efficient energy storage medium your body has access to. It is a battery. A very compact, very dense, very patient battery. And your body has been building that battery for a long, long time. The genetic machinery for fat storage goes back further than Homo sapiens, further than the genus Homo. The adipokines, the hormones that fat tissue secretes to regulate hunger, metabolism, and energy balance, are shared across mammals that diverged from our lineage tens of millions of years ago. This is not a recent feature. This is ancient infrastructure. Your metabolism is not designed for consistency. It is designed for volatility. Think about what the actual nutritional landscape looked like for most of human prehistory. Not a single average day the whole pattern. Successful hunts were irregular. Fruit ripened in bursts and then vanished. Root vegetables were available in certain seasons and not others. Honey, one of the densest calorie sources in the natural world, was rare, defended by insects with a strong opinion about sharing, and wildly seasonal. Your ancestors didn't eat 3 meals a day. They ate when food was there, and they didn't eat when it wasn't. And when it wasn't, could stretch for days. In that context, what does the optimal metabolic strategy look like? It looks exactly like what your body does. When food is abundant, store as much as possible. Upregulate appetite. Make calorie-dense foods taste extraordinary. Build fat reserves aggressively. And then, when food is gone, defend those reserves at almost any cost. Slow the metabolism. Make you think about food constantly, so you go find more of it. That is not a bug. That is the most sensible possible system for surviving a world of random abundance, followed by random scarcity. Your body is a machine built for exactly that world. It is just currently living in this one. Some researchers, and this is a well documented area of study in evolutionary medicine, have proposed that ancient humans may have experienced predictable cycles of weight gain and weight loss closely tied to the seasons, not random fluctuation. Rhythmic, deliberate, almost programmed accumulation. Think about late summer and early autumn. In temperate environments, this was when calories were most available. Ripe fruit in enormous quantities, nuts and seeds coming into season, game animals that had been fattening up all summer. For a foraging human, this would be the richest nutritional period of the entire year. And the biological response to that richness? Eat as much as possible. Store it. Researchers studying modern hunter gatherer populations in seasonal environments have observed body weight fluctuations of 5 to 10% between lean seasons and abundant ones. That's not trivial. That's a significant accumulation of fat tissue, gained deliberately, over weeks, in direct response to caloric availability, and then burned off across the scarcity of winter and early spring. Let that sit for a moment. The fat gain wasn't the problem. The fat gain was the plan. The plan just assumed there would always be a lean season coming. Here's something that doesn't show up in the popular picture of prehistoric health. Ancient humans weren't uniformly lean. The skeletal record is incomplete, and soft tissue doesn't fossilize, so we can't weigh our ancestors. But what we can look at is the isotopic and archaeological record, what people were eating, how much, and in what concentrations. Sites from the Upper Paleolithic and Mesolithic show clear evidence of calorie surplus at certain times of year. Huge deposits of nutshells, evidence of large-scale rendering of animal fat, specifically sought out, specifically processed, specifically stored. Our ancestors weren't just eating for today. They were, in a very real sense, eating ahead, building reserves in their bodies because their bodies told them to, with the same urgency a bear feels before winter. And here's the anthropological detail that tends to stop people. Many cultures that descended from hunter-gatherer populations specifically celebrated fatness, not just accepted it, celebrated it. In several African pastoralist traditions, in some indigenous North American communities, in parts of the Pacific Islands, body fat was a signal of health, of prosperity, of the ability to survive. The aesthetic preference wasn't random. It was a readout of survival probability. A fat person had access to food. A fat person would survive the next drought. A fat person was worth partnering with. That is not primitive. That is coherent. Let's get specific. Given the architecture we've just described, a body designed to store fat aggressively during abundance, what conditions would have produced a genuinely obese prehistoric human? The answer, according to researchers in paleoanthropology and evolutionary medicine, comes down to three overlapping factors: sustained caloric surplus, reduced physical output, and the specific macronutrient composition of available food. Sustained surplus without a subsequent lean period would be unusual in most foraging environments, but not impossible. Coastal and riverine populations had access to remarkably stable food sources. Fish, shellfish, marine mammals, these were calorie-dense and available year-round in a way that inland foragers simply didn't experience. Populations living along productive coastlines or major river systems may have had caloric access that looks, in terms of consistency, not entirely unlike ours. Reduced output could happen. Injury, old age, a particularly abundant and sedentary foraging environment where food came easily and movement was minimal. And the macronutrient piece is interesting. The specific combination of high refined sugar and high fat, the combination that makes modern processed food so exceptionally easy to overconsume, didn't really exist in the ancestral environment in that form. But high fat, high calorie foods absolutely did. Bone marrow, brain tissue, fatty organ meats, rendered animal fat. These were not just accepted, they were preferred. Actively sought. Fought over. The parts of the animal your ancestors wanted most weren't the lean muscle meat. They were the rich, dense, fatty parts that most people today have never eaten and wouldn't recognize. Here's a piece of evidence that tends to make people stop and stare. Between roughly 35,000 and 9,000 years ago, across a geographic range stretching from Western Europe to Siberia, prehistoric people were carving small figurines. mostly from ivory, bone, or soft stone. And a striking proportion of these figurines depict human forms, almost certainly female, with dramatically large abdomens, wide hips, heavy thighs, and large breasts. These are the Venus figurines: the Venus of Willendorf, the Venus of Dolny Vjestonica, the Venus of Lausel, dozens of them across an enormous range of time and space. Now, the interpretation of these figures has been debated for over a century. Some researchers argue they were fertility symbols. Some argue they were self-portraits made by women looking down at their own bodies. Some argue they represent idealized forms associated with abundance. A minority argue they depict real individuals, possibly individuals who were, by the standards of their time, unusually well fed. But here's what almost every interpretation agrees on: whoever made these objects, and whatever they meant by them, was depicting body fat as something meaningful, something worth representing, something worth carving into a piece of mammoth ivory and carrying with you. That doesn't happen in a culture that views fat as failure. There's one more layer here, and it might be the most important one. Your body manages blood sugar through insulin, the hormone secreted by the pancreas that signals cells to absorb glucose. In a modern context, insulin resistance and chronically elevated insulin are closely associated with obesity, type 2 diabetes, and metabolic syndrome. These feel like diseases of excess, of overindulgence, of modern failure. But insulin resistance at low levels may actually have been adaptive in the ancestral environment. Here's the logic. In a world where glucose, quick-burning carbohydrate energy was intermittent and unreliable, mild insulin resistance would have directed glucose toward the brain and other critical organs while forcing the rest of the body to run on fat. This is essentially what happens during fasting, during ketosis, during extended periods of low carbohydrate intake. The body shifts fueling strategies. It burns what's stored. It preserves the brain. Some researchers have proposed that many of the populations most severely affected by metabolic disease today, indigenous populations in the Americas and Pacific Islands, certain South Asian populations carry a higher genetic load of these thrifty metabolic variants precisely because their ancestors lived in environments with even more volatile food access than average. The genes that saved their great-great-grandmothers from starvation are now in an environment of constant food abundance, driving rates of diabetes and obesity at genuinely heartbreaking levels. That is not a personal failure. That is evolutionary mismatch at its most brutal. Here's the part nobody talks about when they run the "but cavemen were healthy" argument. They weren't, by the way. Not uniformly. Hunter-gatherers experienced parasites, infections, injuries, tooth decay from grit in ground food, and a child mortality rate that would make the statistics impossible to read without flinching. Life was not clean or easy or Edenic, but the metabolic diseases, obesity, type 2 diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, cardiovascular disease driven by diet, these were largely absent. Not because ancient humans were disciplined or virtuous, not because they had better willpower or better values around food, because the food environment they evolved in did not permit chronic caloric surplus. Your brain, right now, is running ancient software on a completely different operating system. It is signaling for fat storage in a world where fat storage never ends. It is screaming, eat the fatty thing, eat the sweet thing, eat more than you need right now because you don't know when the next meal is coming, in an environment where the next meal is 17 steps away and costs $4. Every craving you have is biologically rational. Every tendency your body has to store rather than burn is logical. It is just running instructions that were written for a world that no longer exists. Picture your ancestor. 40,000 years ago, maybe more. The fire is low. There's food, real food, finally, after days of very little. And they're eating past comfortable. Not out of greed. Out of biology. Out of a deep, ancient instruction that says, while it's here, use it. While the fire is warm, and the food is real, and the belly is full, let the body do what the body knows how to do. They might have been carrying more weight than usual, that person. Coming into winter with a little extra. Coming into scarcity with a reserve that might actually be the difference. And somewhere in you, in the part of you that reaches for one more thing when you're already full, in the part of you that finds fatty food deeply satisfying in a way that goes beyond taste, that same instruction is still running. Quieter now, maybe, but still there. Yes, ancient humans could get fat. Under the right conditions, a coastal food surplus, an injury induced reduction in activity, a particularly good foraging season with no lean period to follow, a prehistoric human could, and likely did, accumulate body fat beyond what was immediately needed. The biology was always there. The hardware was always capable. What was absent was the permanent, unrelenting, seasonless abundance of the modern food environment. The switch was always installed. The world just finally figured out how to leave it on. So here's the question I'll leave you with, and I genuinely want to know what you think. If you could go back not permanently, just for a year, and live the life your body was actually designed for, with the movement and the hunger and the cold and the feast or famine reality of it, do you think it would feel like suffering? Or do you think somewhere past the discomfort, it might feel a little like coming home? Drop it in the comments. I'll actually read them.